The fighter grips his sword in knuckle-whitened hands and charges into the room. He spies his hated foe, a terrible wicked pit fiend before him, and rushes forward. The barbarian, slightly upset that he wasn't first into the room, follows suit. And the rogue skirts around the corners, remaining hidden, looking for that backstab. And the cleric tentatively steps into the room, preparing healing spells that will most assuredly be needed. And the wizard stays out in the hallway, peeking around the door jamb, knowing that the best way to not die is to stay out of that kill zone. And thus the combat begins, characters rushing forward against their hated foe, and players readying their dice and character sheets. The fighter swings his sword and hits the pit fiend with all his might. The barbarian swings his axe. The rogue stabs with her dagger. The pit fiend slashes and whips with all of its fiery flames sprouting up around it. The cleric calls down healing upon her friends. And the wizard nearly casts fireball, but then goes with magic missile instead. And that was just the first round of combat. In the next round of combat, the fighter swings his sword, the barbarian swings his axe, the rogue stabs with her dagger, the pit fiend slashes and whips, the cleric heals, and the wizard doesn't even think about fireball because he knows better and goes with magic missile instead. And that was just the second round of combat. We now move on to the third round of combat, and I know you know exactly what's coming next, because every single one of us has been in combats like this, haven't we? Round after round after round of the characters doing the exact same thing. They swing with their swords, stab with their daggers, and cast mostly the same spells that they're accustomed to casting every single combat because that's what works, right? And thus the combat essentially comes down to chucking dice and doing math. And I submit to you that this is perhaps the worst sort of combat that we can have in Dungeons & Dragons. Now, there are lots of different things we can do as game masters to make our combats better. In other videos, I've talked about tactics and environment and lots of other things that will spice things up. However, today we're going to talk about something that is perhaps under-addressed in the game, and that's what characters can actually do on their turns. Today, we're going to be looking at a way to give players more options on their turns so that they aren't always having to do the same thing over and over again. And what exactly do I mean by this? Well, we know that the fighter can swing their sword and the barbarian can hack with their axes, right? And the rogue hides and then backstabs. The spellcasters, well, they cast spells. But what if there was something else you could do on your turns? For instance, if you analyze the average D&D combat, characters don't use their movement a whole lot. A lot of times, once you've settled into your position, you kind of stay put. There are certain classes such as rogues and spellcasters to a certain degree that are behooved when they move around. But a lot of times we find that positioning is rather static for most of our turns. So, what would happen if there was something else you could do with your movement action? In other words, you could hack with your sword and then instead of not using your movement and just kind of standing there, what if you could use your movement action to do something else? And another thing that is underused in the game, specifically in combats, are skills. Skills such as animal handling, deception, intimidation, investigation, perception, and survival get a lot of use out of combat, but they're really underrepresented in combat. Now, yes, I know that you can shove somebody or trip them with your athletics. And rogues are gonna do a lot of sneaking with stealth for sure. But the options are very limited and they don't get used a whole lot. So what my team and I have done is create a combat skill system that allows you to use your different skills from your character sheet in combat in meaningful ways. And in our new combat skill system, we have every single skill from the character sheet represented. That means no matter what class you're playing, you will be able to do things with your skills in combat, and you will have more options. Now, the immediate benefit of having more options during combat is that combat gets more interesting. You now have a whole wide new array of abilities that are open to your character. You can do more than just swing your sword or cast the same spells. And it's not an either or. You can swing your sword and use a combat skill, or you can cast your fireball and use a combat skill. Now, of course, this does add complexity to the game. Players are now going to have to choose from an array of different combat skills they can use. And in the game system, we actually call them tactical actions. So there are more choices to be made, and the added complexity will probably result in slightly slower combat. And frankly, this is a trade-off that you make anytime you introduce something new to the game. There is a reduction in speed in exchange for an increase in fun. And as I've said before, when you introduce added complexity to your game, you want to make sure that the resulting fun is increased at least 3 times over. In other words, you want the added complexity to be worth it. And a lot of times the only way you're going to know if it's worth it or not is to try it out. And when we were playtesting these new combat skill options, players really seemed to enjoy them. How the combat skill system works. Okay, so you're probably saying that all sounds wonderful, but how does your stupid combat skill system work, Luke? First of all, it's not stupid, so stop calling my stuff stupid. And I'm going to explain to you how the system works right now, so just calm down. Maybe I'm the one that needs to calm down. I don't know, I can never tell. The standard Dungeons & Dragons turn consists of 3 different types of actions a character can take. They have an action, a bonus action, and movement. And they get 1 of each. In our combat skill system, characters get an action, a bonus action, and a tactical action. So the big change is that movement has been replaced by a tactical action. And with their tactical action, a character can do 1 of 2 things. They can either use their movement or they can use a tactic. And the tactics are the really cool things that you can use that are based upon your skills. They open up a wide array of possibilities in combat. They allow you to do new and different things to affect and change the course of battle. And this intrinsically makes combat more interesting and fun. Because instead of just standing around and swinging your weapons, you now have a ton of new different things you can do on your turns. Now, the tactics that we made fall into 1 of 6 different categories. First, you have attack enhancements. These different tactics give you a bonus to your next attack, and a few of them allow a character to follow up with a bonus action to get a bonus to all their attacks. Next, you have attack penalties. These tactics cause a targeted creature to suffer a penalty to their attacks against you. Then we have area control. These tactics allow you to control a larger area than you normally would be able to. Sometimes this refers to direct control and area denial, but other times it's manipulating the terrain to make traversal more difficult. Then we have concealment. These tactics allow you to conceal your actions. They make it harder for creatures to discern what you're doing, or you can modify an action with the intent of deceiving other creatures. Next up is information. These tactics allow you to gather or convey information. That information may include a battle strategy, current strengths and weaknesses of enemies, or general information about the battle environment. Finally, we have movement. These combat tactics affect the way a creature moves about the battlefield. Unlike all the other tactic categories, these combat tactics always allow you to move up to your movement speed while using the tactic. Now, the really cool thing about this system is that it creates a base upon which you can build your own combat tactics. Now, I'm going to give you several examples of the combat tactics that we have made in the system, but they don't need to stop there. You can literally just make up your own. And it doesn't have to just be the game master who's creating the combat tactics. Players can pitch in with their creativity and their ideas and help come up with more things that can be done with their skills during combat. Of course, it is always wise to review everything for game balance. By the way, if you're finding this information useful, please give me a thumbs up and leave a comment about how delicious bacon is, and share this video with a fellow game master. And if you're not already subscribed to my channel and you think I don't completely suck, why not subscribe while you're at it? The combat tactics. Okay, now I'm going to give you some examples of specific combat tactics from our system. The first one uses your acrobatics skill and is called Prepare. You must be proficient with acrobatics to use this, and its duration is instantaneous. Essentially, you anticipate an attack coming your way from an enemy, and you can dodge out of the way. You roll an acrobatics check, and the result determines the bonus you receive. If you hit a DC 20, you get a +1 bonus to the next dexterity saving throw you make before the start of your next turn. And if you hit a DC 30, you get a +2 bonus. Then we have the Disguise a Spell tactic, which uses the Arcana skill. Essentially, you can attempt to disguise a spell you're going to cast, befuddling attempts to identify it. You make an Intelligence Arcana check, and the DC required to identify a spell that you cast is increased based on the result of the roll. If you hit a DC 20, the difficulty class to identify the spell has a +1 bonus. A DC 25 gets you a +2 bonus, and a DC 30 gets you a +3 bonus. So essentially, you're trying to trick an enemy into thinking that you're casting a different spell. It does not alter the spell component requirements. It only makes it seem like the spell being cast is something different. Okay, here's one that's really useful if basic, one that melee types will probably love. It uses the athletics skill. This tactic is called Strengthen Strike. Basically, you make an athletics check, and then your next attack deals extra damage based on the result of your roll. A DC 20 gets you a +1 to your damage rolls, a DC 25 gets you a +2, and a DC 30 gets you a +3. And then we have the Determine Intent tactic, which uses your insight skill. You see, we're giving useful things you can do with some of these skills that almost never get used in the game, and especially not in combat. Anyway, this combat tactic allows you to attempt to discern a creature's intent by observing the subtleties of its behavior. You can make an insight check contested by the target's charisma saving throw. On a success, you learn one of the following: the target of the creature's next attack, spell, or other action it intends to use on its turn, whether the creature intends to make a melee attack, ranged attack, or cast a spell, its loyalty to its allies or whoever it's working for, or its degree of personal hostility to you. For this tactic, the information you learn is random, but you may attempt to learn a specific piece of information by taking a -5 penalty to your check. And this next tactic is called Area Denial, and it uses your intimidation skill. Essentially, it allows you to attempt to control an area larger than you could normally control using your threats and stance to keep enemies away. This doesn't expand the range of your attack or your attack of opportunity, but it does prevent enemy creatures from moving through the space. And then you're gonna roll an intimidation check, and if you hit certain thresholds of difficulty classes, you control additional 5-foot squares adjacent to the one that you're standing on. Now, in our combat skill system, we literally have 32 different tactical actions characters can take on their turn. So I'm not gonna talk our way through every single one of them. That would just take a crazy amount of time, and I'm not sure how extremely valuable you would find it in a video format. But what about monsters? Now imagine that my fellow dungeon masters out there have been asking themselves a particular question. Do monsters get to do this too? Because if players now get to do all these cool things, am I as the game master going to get to do them as well? And the long and short of it is that yes, monsters get to do all those cool things too. Otherwise, we would have a rather unbalanced system, wouldn't we? And the very next follow-up question or complaint or concern that I know my fellow dungeon masters are going to bring up is that the skills of monsters in D&D 5th edition generally suck. And you are 100% right. Like, you have big, huge, massive, large or huge creatures that are like CR 5, 8, and 10 that have no athletics modifiers. Many monsters just simply don't have the skills on their stat block, or the skills are very limited. And frankly, this is kind of understandable because in the base system, monsters don't really have much use for many of their skills. However, if you're implementing our combat skill system, monsters now suddenly have something they can do with those skills. And this could be pretty cool and fun and exciting for dungeon masters, I imagine. Well, the question then is, what is the game master going to do with these monsters who have sucky skills? And of course we address that in our system, otherwise having monsters use skill checks based on their ability scores with no modifiers would be, well, pathetic. The basic rule of thumb is that you take a monster, identify its highest and second highest ability scores, and then you give that monster proficiency and perhaps even expertise in all skills associated with those ability scores. In fact, I would recommend taking its highest ability score and giving the monster expertise in all related skills. This means the monster would add double its proficiency bonus to those skills. And then for its second highest ability score, you give the monster basic proficiency with all related skills. And once you've done this, you're pretty much good to go. Your monster is going to have a variety of skills that they can use, and the modifiers to use those skills are going to be pretty darn good. Now, something else that I want to mention here is that giving your monsters additional abilities that they can use during combat is going to help solve one of the problems that has plagued Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition from its conception. Essentially, what we have seen over the last decade is that players and their characters continue to get buffs and receive more options and more power. But monsters have not. They basically lag behind on the power curve, and for many groups, this is undesirable because it makes combat less challenging and unengaging. Which means that if game masters want to correct for that, they need to tweak things in their games. And giving monsters the ability to use these combat tactics is one such tweak that a dungeon master could do. Especially if, as the dungeon master, you start using all of these combat skills to buff your monsters, but your players don't get to use them. But that would just be devious. I'm not sure that I would recommend that. how to keep combat moving. Okay, now something that I alluded to toward the beginning of the video that I want to address in more depth now is the idea that introducing this new added complexity, these new combat tactics, are going to slow the game down a bit. So I have a few pieces of advice for ways that game masters can keep combat moving along when using this new system. The first one is that when you're preparing for the session and setting up the encounters, consider each creature's role in the encounter. That is, your monsters. Some will be attackers, others will be defenders, and some will focus on support. And then based on the creature's role and which skills it can best use, make quick notes about which tactic it is most likely to use and which tactic it is second most likely to use. That way you have these notes on the stat block, and during combat you can quickly choose from a couple options. You might even jot down 2 additional tactics as backups. But the last thing that you want to do when you're in combat is for every single monster be flipping through and choosing from 32 different abilities, because that's how many we've published in our rule system. That is going to bog things down like crazy. You need to have a few optimal choices ready to go for each monster that you can quickly choose from, and that is going to speed things up incredibly. Now, as far as players go, I suggest strongly encouraging them to choose out their combat tactic while everyone else is taking their turns. I mean, they got like 10 or 15 minutes at least to figure it out, right? And then if on their turn they're not ready to go, they should have a backup tactic. This is basically a combat tactic that they will take if they have a hard time choosing what to do. If they're a fighter, for instance, they might always use the strengthened strike tactic, which increases their damage. But obviously this kind of goes without saying, the more everyone is familiar with the different combat tactics and reads up on them before the game begins, the smoother gameplay is going to be. Now, I think I've given you enough information in this video to be able to use our new combat skill system, though you will, of course, have to make up your own tactical actions. However, if you'd like to get our entire combat skill system, along with all 32 tactical actions that we created, it's available right now on the DM Lair store at the link below. Also, during this month, all DM Lair patrons at the $25 level and above will get it as part of their monthly Patreon benefits. And by the way, our DM Lair patrons get tons of other monthly benefits as well. For instance, you get a new issue of Lair magazine every month, which includes roughly 60 pages of 5th edition Game Master resources such as adventures, monsters, traps, puzzles, and more, and it also comes in Pathfinder 2 as well. Patrons also get adventures and monsters in Foundry VTT, which makes prepping for your online game a breeze. So if you're thinking of picking up the combat skill system, but you'd also like to get a taste of all the other cool things that we publish at the DM Lair, becoming a $25 patron is definitely the way to go. Let me know down in the comments what you do to spice up your combat so they aren't boring and repetitive. And if you'd like to learn how to implement a reputation system in your games that gives characters benefits and drawbacks based on their reputation with groups and NPCs in the world, watch this video right here. And until next time, happy game mastering.